Chapter 17 of The World's Lumber Room by Selina GAYE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17, Household Refuse. Nature's scavengers are not perfect, but the result of their labours on the whole is that where nature is left to herself, not only is nothing wasted, but refuse of all kinds is so speedily disposed of that we seldom come across anything to disgust either sight or sense of smell. Where man comes on the scene, indeed, the case is different. But nature can no more be expected to dispose of his refuse for him than to feed and clothe him and provide for his other wants, though he oftentimes leaves a great deal to her, and owes her, as Miss Staveley reminds us, always far more than he is generally aware of. Certainly in the matter of scavenging, man does not compare favourably with nature, for she knows nothing of the accumulations of filth and rubbish with which he is puzzled to deal. And after watching her labourers at their work, it is rather humiliating to glance at a dust-yard and be compelled to own, as one must, that she manages matters in a much neater and altogether less offensive way than we do. Throughout the East, scavenging, even in the towns and villages, is left chiefly to her good offices, as we have seen, and many a village on the hills about the Bosphorus owes such cleanliness as it possesses to the occasional heavy falls of rain. In Ceylon, the Chandalas, who belonged to the lowest caste, were degraded to the office of scavengers and carriers of corpses. And in the legends of Buddha, the Chandala is represented as one born in the open air, his parents not being possessed of a roof. He lies among the pots when his mother goes to cut firewood. And, says Manu, he can never be relieved from bondage or emancipated by a master. In 437 BC, the Nietzsche Chandalas are specially named as cemetery men. But a couple of centuries later, cremation had been introduced, and their services were no longer required in the cemeteries. Not very much above the Chandala in the social scale come the Paris chiffonniers, who form a class as much apart from the rest of the community as if they were separated by the laws of caste. The chiffonnier, or ragman, no more confines his attention exclusively to rags than the dustman does to genuine dust. He is a by no means romantic or attractive-looking individual, and it is difficult at first sight to understand why he should be such a favourite character with French novelists, and how he acquired the halo of romance which surrounds him at the present day. According to the popular legend, every chiffonnier is a nobleman, or at least a gentleman, in disguise, or perhaps a learned professor who has met with reverses, or has other reasons for shunning the society of his equals. But the chiffonnier would never have held this position in the public imagination had he, like the dustman, pursued his unsavoury occupation in broad daylight. It is his little dark lantern, and the fact that he does not emerge from his place of retirement until nightfall, which have combined to make him such an object of mystery and interest. Like his Italian brother, and like most of the scavengers employed by nature, he appears with the owls and bats, prowls about in the deserted silent streets at the most unearthly hours, and when the sun rises, he vanishes into his own quarter of the city, and is seen no more till night returns again. We, who are accustomed to seeing the dust carts on their daily rounds, may well wonder what the chiffonnier can find in the streets to fill his wicker basket, and our wonder will increase when we learn that, according to the official returns, 7,050 men and women make their living in this way in Paris, and earn, some of them, as much as 3 francs a day. The fact is that as regards its scavenging, the elegant city of Paris has not hitherto been much in advance of Constantinople or Cairo. All the dust and refuse of the houses was simply thrown out into the street. Footnote, this was also the case in Rome until of late years. End footnote. Where the chiffonnier rummaged in it at his leisure with an iron hook, or a stick having a crooked nail at the end, carrying off all that he could in any way turn to account, and leaving only the refuse of the refuse to be cleared away by the carts or devoured by rats, hundreds of which may be seen running about the streets in all directions late at night. Of late, however, he has been thrown into great consternation by an order from the prefect of the city, who considers that it would be more conducive to health and cleanliness if the dust of each house were collected in some receptacle and put outside in the morning to be emptied into the dust carts when they make their rounds. This plan is followed in Boulogne and several British towns, and has great advantages over the system of dustbins, since the refuse is removed daily before it has time to decay and become injurious. And as the dustmen have merely to empty the tub or box, the dust of a whole street can be carried away in the time which it now takes them to empty a few dustbins. However, Paris has raised a great outcry against the new regulation, for reasonable as it is, it means little less than ruin to the poor chiffonnier. When the dust is simply thrown into the street, he can poke about in it easily and soon pick out all that he cares to take. But if it were all collected in a deep tub or such like receptacle, it would be long before he could ascertain what treasures might be hidden in its depths, and could make sure that he was not leaving anything valuable behind. And then, worse than all, the time for making these minute investigations would not be allowed him, for the dust would not be put out of the houses until the morning, and the carts would come and take it away before he had even a chance of completing his search. The chiffonnier's principal treasures are bones, rags, paper, scraps of copper, sardine cases and other tins, and broken glass. And of these, 200 weights, about 100 kilos, of bones bring him 4 francs, the same weight of paper from 1 to 5 francs, according to the quality, woolen rags 40 francs, copper 80 francs, tins 3 francs, white glass 6 francs, and green bottle glass 1 franc 20 centimes, or about a shilling. Footnote: a franc is worth 9pence halfpenny of English money. End footnote. Cigar ends are also carefully collected and converted into régie cigarettes. Money, jewellery, and the like he is expected to give up to the concierge or porter of the house opposite which he has found it, and he bears a high character for honesty in this respect. The sardine and other tins, of which such thousands are thrown away, go to support a branch of industry which is deeply interesting to the youthful part of the population, for after being stamped into shape by machines of simple construction, they reappear in the form of countless armies of tin soldiers, which are sold at prices so low that the manufacturer could not possibly afford to buy his raw material new from the tin man. Rag picking is a calling which anyone is free to pursue, but still the fraternity have their rules and regulations, and are divided into well-marked ranks. Lowest of all are the biffins, or chineurs, who are half desperadoes and half amateurs, people who are something else by day and go out fortune-seeking in a random, irregular way at night. They are not in favour with the other chiffonniers, for they either do not know or do not respect the customs of the society, and being apt to encroach on other people's rights, are looked upon as bunglers and dabblers, a disturbing element, in fact, calculated to throw the well-regulated machinery of the body out of gear. The rouleurs are more respectable than these, and have each their own particular districts in which they make their rounds. They do not trespass on their neighbours' property, and expect to have their own hunting grounds treated with equal respect. The placiers occupy the highest rank of all, and as the aristocrats of the brotherhood have the privilege of overhauling the dust before it is turned out into the street. The concierge, who knows them well and treats them with benevolent condescension, allows them even to come into the house and pick the dust over undisturbed. A placier will visit from 10 to 30 houses in this way, and in return for the indulgence shown him will fetch water or do any other little service for the concierge. His place is worth something in a wealthy neighbourhood, and when he retires from the business he sells it to his successor, who makes his first appearance with him one Sunday morning in a tidy suit of clothes, and is formally introduced to all the concierges on his beat, and is recommended to their kind consideration. It is said that some placiers have paid as much as 1,000 francs for their business. Besides the chiffonniers of these three classes, there are, above them again, the contractors, who buy the refuse of them, have it sorted by day labourers, and then sell it again in large quantities. There are about 100 such contractors in Paris, and of these 4 or 5 turn over millions of francs in the course of the year. Many are very wealthy, and all soon become well-to-do. There is a certain Monsieur Berton who has made himself conspicuous in the Paris elections since 1868 by offering himself as a candidate, printing his addresses on rose-coloured paper, and promising prosperity to mankind in general, and the Parisians in particular, if only they will give him a seat in the Chamber of Deputies or on the Municipal Council. This gentleman was for 20 years a dust contractor, and retired from the business when still comparatively young, with a yearly income of 60,000 francs, £2,040, earned for him by the rouleurs and placiers. The chiffonniers live in certain streets, which are occupied by members of the fraternity only. The best known of these is Rue Mouffetard, on the left bank of the Seine, but there are also large colonies at Montrouge, Montmartre, and La Villette, and everywhere their habitations look more like gypsy camps than anything else. Their huts are built of the most extraordinary materials, the walls being either of kneaded mud or, like those of the ancient lake dwellers, of wattle filled in with clay. A carriage wheel often does duty for a window, the spaces between the spokes being covered with oiled paper, and the roof consists of tarpaulin, or at best of pieces of roofing paper patched together. Some few buildings are constructed of brick, gypsum, or wooden spars, but these are owned only by the very prosperous. Great cleanliness is, of course, out of the question, considering the nature of the goods which are piled up in and around the huts until they are sold. But the chiffonnier is personally less dirty than might be expected, and his health is as good as that of other poor people. Most of the fraternity have been chiffonniers all their lives, for the calling is hereditary in certain families, and has been so for so many generations that the chiffonniers form a distinct caste, speaking, as Mr. Symonds says, not a word of real French. They have to work hard, making usually 2 journeys every night from the outskirts to the heart of the city. They have to turn night into day, and to carry heavy loads, and they must go out whatever the weather may be. But if their earnings are but moderate, they are, at all events, regular, and much more certain than those of many callings which rank far higher in the public estimation. They are always on very good terms with the police, and though they may be said to be almost outside the pale of civilization, are usually of no religion, and live and die without having any very certain civil standing, still crimes are almost unknown among them, and they are some of the most peaceable and orderly inhabitants of the unquiet city of Paris. They have never taken any part in the frequent revolutions. They kept tranquil during the Commune, and, it is said, went their nightly rounds and calmly picked their dust heaps, even during that fearful week in 1871, when one part of the beautiful city was in flames, and Versaillists and communards were fighting like savages in other quarters. In England we have no one who at all answers to the chiffonnier, but we have the rag, bone, and bottle man, the rabbit and hareskin man, the hawker who takes old clothes and old hats in exchange for pots of flowers and crockery, and we are told that there are nearly 1,000 persons who make their living by selling second-hand articles in the streets of London alone. Much might be said on the subject of old clothes, the largest dealers in which do so large a trade that they are known as merchants, and export their goods to all parts of the world. Long before the French Revolution, it was an established custom that there should be an annual sale at the Tuileries of all the discarded garments belonging to the royal family, the proceeds of which were ostensibly given to the poor. The practice was revived by the Empress Josephine, and continued through all the various changes of dynasty until the establishment of the present republic. A long gallery in the basement of the palace, looking into the garden, was fitted throughout its whole length with oak wardrobes, which were usually well filled in the course of the year. When the time for the sale came, the shutters were closed, the gallery was brilliantly lighted up, and visitors were admitted by invitation cards issued by the attendants of the Queen or Empress. Every article was ticketed with its price, from which, of course, there was no deviation. But the chief part was generally bought up by the valets and women of the wardrobe, and they disposed of all that remained unsold to the great dealers, who again sold the goods to their customers at immense prices. Many are the vicissitudes of old clothes, many are the hands through which they pass, whether given away or sold, and with every change they drop a little lower in the social scale, becoming shabbier and shabbier, until at last, when they will hold together no longer, they are sold as rags, and forthwith enter upon a fresh career. The trade in old clothes is almost entirely in the hands of Jews, whose great mart is in Houndsditch. Some articles are sold just as they are, others are mended, patched, translated, and made to look like new. The skirts of a coat, being the part least worn, are easily converted into children's clothes, but old black cloth always has a certain value even when too far gone to make miniature waistcoats or knickerbockers. France takes the best of it to make up into caps, and that which is still more threadbare is bought up for the same purpose by Russia and Poland. The black velvet waistcoats, still worn as best by certain classes, are converted into skullcaps for German and Polish Jews. The bulk of our old clothes goes to Holland and Ireland, but the vast majority of the scarlet coats worn by officers in the army are said to find their way to the annual fair held at Leipzig. Regimentals, smart liveries, robes of office, etc., are greatly admired by the natives of the west coast of Africa, and many of them are therefore dispatched thither. But the red tunics of the British infantry are chiefly bought by the Dutch, who make them into under waistcoats which are worn next to skin by every careful working man, since they are believed to be effectual in keeping off rheumatism, a matter of no small importance in their watery country. Footnote: until recently, soldiers have been allowed to dispose of old uniforms as they pleased, and have been careful of their clothes accordingly, knowing that the better their condition, the better price they would fetch. At Aldershot, the old clothes dealers used to drive a very satisfactory trade, but disused uniforms have now to be returned in accordance with an order to that effect to the authorities. End footnote. The grey overcoats of the infantry are sold at the Cape and in our own agricultural districts, where they are bought especially by the shepherds. The heavier and more valuable cloaks of the artillerymen are bought by the Dutch, and Holland and Ireland together are the purchasers of all the police uniforms. A hat is an article which possesses a certain value as long as it will hold together and keep any shape at all. And it is wonderful what may be done with a battered old chimney pot by means of cutting down, relining, brown paper, glue, rabbit fur, dye, and varnish. By judicious treatment, the old hat may be made to look, for a time at least, like a smart new one, and as long as it is worn only in fine weather, the purchaser will no doubt congratulate himself on his bargain. But the first shower will reduce the whole fabrication to a shapeless mass, and he will probably regret the 3 francs which he has spent on the purchase. It is the French Jew who is especially clever at dealing with old hats, which he buys from the chiffonnier at 8 sous apiece and sells at a considerable profit for the sum above mentioned. "Stockings! You can get as good stockings as anybody wants for 3 halfpence a pair," says a poor woman living in Holborn. "They gives a penny a pound for stockings at the rag shop and sells them at a halfpenny a leg, and if you buys 3 legs you can make a first-rate pair of stockings good enough for anyone." But there comes a time in the existence of old clothes, whatever the rank of life in which they started, when they are too old and patched and faded and threadbare either for the dealers or the pawnbrokers. In fact, they are no longer clothes, but rags, and in this condition they find their way to the rag shops, either directly or through the medium of the dust cart. It has been stated that not more than 2/5 of the rags in England are preserved, and manufacturers are consequently obliged to import large quantities, an expense which might be entirely spared to the country if people were more thrifty. The London Ragged School at one time started some of its boys with 4 trucks, with the result that in 9 months they had collected 82 tons of rags and other refuse, and 50,000 bottles. It is reckoned that each 600 houses would well supply 1 truck. But the Lancashire famine diverted all the rags in another direction, and the attempt to collect them does not seem to have been made again. In former days, every thrifty housewife had a rag bag, into which were put not only rags, but all the snippings which result from the process of cutting out, and are now too often consigned to the fire. Some countries altogether forbid the export of rags, and our chief supplies are drawn from Italy and Germany, of which we are large customers. All old woolen clothes come to the soil at last, being extremely valuable as manure. The early broccoli grown in the west of Cornwall thrive better on woolen rags than on anything else, and hops of a certain quality cannot, it is said, be grown without them. But good rags are so valuable for other purposes besides these that it is chiefly the seams and other unusable parts which are put away to rot and then sent to the Kentish hop fields. But for the fact that old wool can be used again, all our woolen goods would be double the present price, for 1/3 of the manufactures of this country are supplied by shoddy and mungo, that is, wool and worsted, no matter how old, which are reduced to their former state and then rewoven. In 1882 we imported 37,511 tons of woolen rags, at a cost of £820,616. Most of them are bought up by Dewsbury and 2 or 3 neighbouring towns, where they are torn to pieces by sharp spikes and worked up into cheap cloth for the slaves of South America, or respun with the addition of new wool and manufactured into all kinds of woolen goods. The devil's dust, as it is called, after the machine employed for this purpose, which is produced by the tearing up of the rags, befouls the whole town of Dewsbury, and is so injurious to the workpeople engaged in the factories that they are obliged to keep their mouths muffled. Some of the rags are ground to powder, variously coloured, and used for the making of flock papers and artificial flowers. Some are taken by the paper mills and made into blotting and other papers of an absorbent character, and some again, after being boiled with pearl ash, horns, hoofs, hoof and hide clippings, blood, old iron, waste leather, etc., reappear in the form of yellow crystals of prussiate of potash used in dyeing, and from this again the beautiful colour known as Prussian blue is manufactured. Rags of all kinds are in great demand for the paper mills, many of which use more than 30 tons a week. All are welcome, whether silk, wool, linen, cambric, lace, holland, fustian, corduroy, bagging, canvas, and even, though these cannot be called rags, old ropes. In fact, almost any species of tough fibre, even the roots and bine of hops, vine tendrils, cabbage stalks, and straw, may be made into paper. Straw alone makes the paper too brittle to be serviceable, unless the silica contained in it be destroyed, but it is frequently mixed with other materials. Still, it is not probable that anything will ever lessen the value of rags, since they must needs go on accumulating and being disposed of in one way or another, and are, therefore, to be had cheaper than anything else. Before they come to the mill, it is necessary that the rags should be sorted, that the paper maker may know exactly of what the bulk is composed, and determine its destination accordingly. old rope being made into coarse brown paper, and the refuse of the flax mills into tracing paper, while the paper for banknotes is made from the best white linen. Footnote: the tunics of the Jewish priests are said to have been unravelled and used as wicks for the lamps during the Feast of Tabernacles. End footnote. In 1882, we imported 21,200 tons of linen and cotton rags of very various degrees of cleanliness, those from Italy being lowest in the scale, while some of the English ones are said to be so clean as to require no bleaching. Rags have one advantage besides their cheapness over all other materials, in that the repeated washings which they have undergone while in use as wearing apparel are an excellent preparation for their conversion into paper. The first thing done with them is to open all the seams, take out any stray pins and needles, and remove buttons, which might injure the machinery or spoil the quality of the paper. Women are employed in this part of the business, and they stand before horizontal frames covered with very coarse wire cloth, and having a large knife fixed upright in the centre, with the blade turned away from them. The bulk of the rags are cut up by machinery, but those intended for very fine paper are cut by hand into small pieces about 4 inches square, by being drawn across the edge of the knife. Much of the dirt and sand passes through the wire cloth into a drawer below during this process. The remainder is beaten out by machinery, and the rags are then boiled with soda and lime. Clean white rags are said to yield from 65 to 80% of their weight in paper. Statistics for 1884 show that there were in that year 3,985 mills in the world, which together produced nearly 17.5 million hundredweights of paper, of which the newspapers use about 1/3. But the rags have not come to an end of their career when worked up into paper, for the paper itself may be used over and over again, and clean waste paper yields from 75 to 80% of its weight in new paper. No paper, we are told, need be wasted, since it has been found possible to remove even the stain of printing ink. But still, no doubt, far more is consumed by cook and housemaid in the lighting of fires than is at all necessary. A whole newspaper seems to be considered a by no means extravagant allowance for one fire by some people, though it would light much better with 1/4 the quantity, or even less. There are many shops where newspapers are bought at the rate of a penny a pound, which seems to be a protest against waste. But it must be confessed that there is not much encouragement to people to save their waste paper at present, in spite of the alluring advertisements offering to buy it up. In the country, where space is less valuable, room may be found for 2 or 3 sacks, perhaps, in an outhouse, and then it may be worth while to send them periodically to paper mills or other buyers. But in London, 1 sack is about as much as most people can accommodate, and for this 2 or 3 shillings, repayable when the sack is returned, have to be deposited. It takes a long time, really, to fill a sack, and when filled and fetched away, it not unfrequently happens that a note is received saying that the value of the paper just balances the expense of fetching it, and this even when the distance is less than a 10-minutes walk. People who have had such an experience as this, which is not uncommon, will certainly not care to take the trouble of making another collection, or to give up the space needed for the sack. But no doubt many would be glad to give away the accumulations from their waste paper baskets, etc., if only someone would call for them periodically. Meanwhile, however, large quantities of waste paper do find their way back to the paper mills, to be remade either into paper or papier-mâché, in which latter manufacture no paper of any kind comes amiss. Tons of old account books, bankers' books, and of ledgers, cuttings of bookbinders, of pasteboard makers, of envelope and pocket-book makers, of print sellers, of paper hangers, etc., are disposed of for this purpose, and reappear as cornices, picture frames, bulkheads, cabin partitions, pianoforte cases, chairs, tables, etc., not to mention the thousands of little fancy articles which are made of papier-mâché. There are three kinds of papier-mâché: a sort of pasteboard in which sheets of paper are merely pasted together, which is much used for tea trays; a more solid kind in which the paper is pressed until it becomes hard enough to take a polish; and a third variety in which the paper is reduced to a pulp, in which condition it may be moulded into any shape that may be desired. Paper in the form of papier-mâché is daily being applied to fresh uses. Not long ago a daily paper announced that a factory chimney had been made of it. In America it has been used for the rails of railroads, the pulp being, it is said, as solid as metal, much more durable, and less influenced by atmospheric changes than iron or steel. Pasteboard wheels, made of equal parts of wood pulp and straw, have been used exclusively for many years past by the Pullman Palace Car Company. Much waste paper finds its way to the dust contractor's yard, where it becomes the property of the moulder, at least in some yards, for the regulations are not quite the same everywhere. The moulder is the foreman of the yard. He pays the sifters himself, and makes his own profits out of the paper, rags, bones, glass, iron, metal of all sorts, string and corks. The contractor has the hard and soft core and the coals and cinders. The hard core, consisting of broken crockery, earthenware, oyster shells, etc., is sold for road making, but is now frequently unsaleable and has to be got rid of at a loss. The soft core, consisting of all sorts of organic matter, refuse from fish shops, greengrocers, etc., is sold for manure, and the veritable dust or soil, which is as fine as gunpowder, is said to be especially useful for cultivating marshlands and clover, and was at one time so much sought after by farmers that shiploads of it were brought from the north. Some of it is also bought by the brickmakers to mix with clay. Rags are not sorted in the yard, but sold in the lump to a Jew. The largest cinders and the coals are bought by laundresses and braziers, the smaller, called breeze, by the brickmakers, who use them as fuel to burn between the layers of bricks. In some yards the sifters are allowed to take wood, corks, and a daily quantity of cinders as their perquisites, the allowance of the latter being so liberal that little markets are frequently held at the entrance to the yard, where the poor of the neighbourhood come to buy cheap fuel. In some places the women are also allowed pill-boxes and gallipots, and any crockery that can be matched and mended, and they may also appropriate the skins of dead cats. Cat skins are worth from 4d. to 6d., the highest price being given for white skins. They are used not only as fur, dyed or undyed, but are made into a sort of velvet which has a very good appearance, and cat and rabbit skins are also converted into felt hats. The fashion of fur tippets has, in all likelihood, considerably raised the value of skins. Hare and rabbit skins do not usually find their way into the dustbin, but are bought up by dealers in this particular kind of refuse. People in England do not make nearly as much use of them as their neighbours, and export 2/3 of them, that is, 8 or 9 million a year, to Germany, France, and Belgium. Hare skins are much valued as chest preservers, and fetch from 18s. 6d. to 28s. the hundred. Dust sifting is necessarily a very rough and dirty occupation, but the wages are not bad, being from 8s. to 10s. a week in money, besides the perquisites, and the health of the dustwomen is said to be exceptionally good. In one large yard, during the prevalence of cholera and smallpox, not a single person engaged there was even attacked. The constant living in the open air, and the fact that they are obliged to use a good deal of soap and water, no doubt has much to do with their good health. Corks are recut or used in the making of Kamptülichen floorcloth. In Paris, old corks are collected from the Seine, washed, recut, and sold at a few sous the hundred. Waste cork, that which is too rough for cork making, finds its use as floats for fishermen and the stuffing of horse collars. Old boots and shoes go first to the translators, who patch them till they can be patched no more, and then they are boiled down into glue. A daily paper some time since gave curious statistics on the subject of old boots and shoes, which had been brought to light in the course of inquiries instituted in New York by the superintendent of the census. In New York and Brooklyn, about 3 million pairs of old shoes are thrown away every year, and used to be plentiful in the gutters in some parts. They have now become scarce, however, as they are diligently picked up and used for 3 purposes. Those which are not too far gone are patched and greased and sold to the people who deal in such goods. Many folk wear one shoe much more than the other, and the dealers find pairs for the odd ones. The shoes not worth patching are cut up, and the good bits are used for patching other shoes, while all the worthless parts are converted into Jamaica rum by a process known only to the manufacturers. It is said they are boiled in pure spirits and allowed to stand for a few weeks, and that the product far surpasses rum made in the ordinary way. Broken glass of all kinds always finds a ready market, and may reappear on our tables over and over again, for in making glass it is usual to melt the materials together with a quarter or half their weight of cullet, or broken glass, of the same kind, so that many 100 tons are wanted in the course of the year. Of late, moreover, the coarsest kinds of broken glass have had another destiny opened up to them, being bought by a manufacturer, Mr. Rust, who melts them down, colours the paste any tint he chooses by a secret process of his own, and when it is cold, breaks it into irregular fragments of various sizes, with which he produces very effective mosaics for the decoration of shops and other buildings, and as the materials are cheap, he is able to sell them at prices much below those at which any other mosaics can be bought. Broken bottles are also ground up to make glass paper. The common kinds are made of the coarsest materials, of which rough sand and soap as waste are some of the principal. Dirty water and soap suds from laundries are used for watering gardens, or the grease is recovered and turned into soap again. The water in which fleeces have been washed yields fatty salts called swint, from which potash salts are made, and also soap used in scouring woolen manufactures. Bones are the only other considerable item which come under the head of household refuse. In Russia they are either exported or simply wasted, that is, so far as man is concerned, being left to nature to dispose of at her leisure. In more civilized countries they are put to a variety of uses, the majority of them going first to the bone boilers to have the animal matter, oil and gelatin, extracted. Simply ground to dust, they form a valuable manure, and are imported in quantities from Australia in the shape of bone dust tiles. As bone meal, they are used for feeding cattle. At a large dyeing establishment in Manchester, bones are boiled for the sake of the gelatin or size, which is used for stiffening goods. The fat is sold to the candle makers, and size, liquor, and bones are bought for manure. After boiling and bleaching, processes which render them more brittle than before, bones may go on to the turner to be made into knife handles, tooth and nail brushes, buttons, and the like. Bone black, or animal charcoal as it is popularly but improperly called, is made by burning bones in closed vessels. From it is made the ivory black of the artist, and it is also used in the manufacture of blacking. Bone charcoal is employed for refining sugar, and is so absorbent that it will take all the colour out of treacle, or sugar water coloured with indigo, leaving them quite white. The charcoal may be used over and over again by washing and heating, and when finally exhausted for refining purposes, is used for manure and the manufacture of phosphorus. A word must be said about the old tin and ironware, kettles, pots and pans, etc., which are sometimes consigned to the dustbin. The tin soldier business seems to be confined to the Continent. In England, the best parts of an ancient tin kettle are clipped out, cut into shape, punched with holes, blacked and varnished, and used to strengthen the edges and corners of cheap trunks. Old iron may, of course, be melted down, but before this happens it frequently takes a voyage as ballast, and large shiploads of frying pans, gridirons, saucepans, candlesticks, tea trays, boilers, shovels, old corrugated iron roofing, the produce of the old iron shops and the findings of the Thames mudlarks, are sent off to the United States and the Continent. Our exports of this description reached 132,033 tons in 1882 and were valued at £507,161. Saucepans and frying pans naturally lead one to think of food, and in concluding our notice of household refuse, we may mention a curious market held at the Halles Centrales in Paris for the sale of broken meat of all kinds, which was described at length by the correspondent of the London Daily Telegraph in 1878. Quote, "The fragments which form the jewellery of the Halles Centrales are brought down in big baskets between 7 and 8 every morning by the garçons of the great boulevard restaurants, or by the larbins from the hotels of the ministers or the foreign ambassadors." End quote. If a grand dinner has been given the night before at one of the embassies, the show of jewellery in the morning will be magnificent. There will be whole turkeys and fowls, hams and boars' heads which have been scarcely touched, displayed upon the deal boards. Out of the season, the supply comes chiefly from the leading restaurants, where the leavings are the perquisites of the waiters. Some dealers, and they are nearly always women, have a yearly contract with particular restaurants. Some arrange the goods themselves, others, feeling that it is a matter of importance and that they do not possess the requisite taste and skill, engage a professional hand to do it for them. The object, of course, is to make a very little seem a great deal, and also to render the various portions as attractive to the eye as possible. And the artists flit from stall to stall, giving here and there a touch of green in the shape of spinach or Brussels sprout, or of red in the form of carrot or tomato, adding a morsel of blancmange here, a bit of pie crust there, and so on, until each portion looks as it should. The portions are arranged on quarter sheets of old newspapers, and vary in price from 2 sous upwards. As a sample, imagine a pile consisting of the leg of a partridge, the remnants of an omelette, the tail of a fried sole, 2 ribs of a jugged hare, a spoonful of haricot beans, a scrap of fillet, a cut pear, a handful of salad, a slice of tomato, and a dab of jelly, all to be had for 5 sous or 2pence halfpenny. The purchasers are not the cheap eating houses, as has been supposed, but the quiet poor, people who are ashamed to beg, and but for the merciful cheapness of these appetizing scraps, would not taste meat from one month's end to another. End of chapter 17.